Okay, everybody, thank you very much for joining. We're going to have a fabulous workshop on Giorgione today, part two of Silent Poetics on Painting. And as you can expect, I couldn't really begin a workshop. My sentiments simply wouldn't allow me to conduct this workshop without an acknowledgement of the death of the Queen last week on Thursday, the 8th of September, 2022. Her passing and the end of her reign have deeply affected me, and I believe that it is a loss which has a profound moral and epochal significance. She was truly inspiring for her dedication, fidelity, her constancy, and care during a lifetime bound to a duty which she had placed upon her. I must express my own gratitude to have been born in a country in which she fulfilled that duty in a manner which both preserved tradition and positively guided the course of Britain's future. We have been free under her rule while she has served the country. The reasons I'm expressing these feelings are many in number, but one of the most important is that our monarchy places at the heart of our nation not an official, not a bureaucrat, not a politician, but a family. The symbolic meaning of this has so much importance to our culture. It allows the true and organic traditions of this country to remain a vital aspect of her character. Also, our freedoms. This is one of the freest societies in the world, and that is very much bound up within the principles of monarchy, which are tied up to the ancient and medieval ethics of chivalry, of duty, and that those who inherit obligation are bound to duty. Monarchs used to lead armies throughout the Middle Ages, and they fought in battle, and they would reward those who distinguished themselves by displaying nobility of character and fortitude. The monarchs would ennoble those individuals, even if they were of low rank. Our Queen continued this by elevating those who exhibited brilliance in civic life with their pursuit of beneficial enterprises, discoveries in science, and contributions to the arts. She was the woman at the heart of the country and who we could all look to with feelings of loyalty and love. My belief in drawing from history and in tradition being fundamentally empowering is why I had to include these words regarding the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Something of the spirit of the nation has gone, and something in the spirit of all of us who belong to the nation has gone. And I hope it will be reborn in the spirit of King Charles III. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. And that's what I wanted to say about the passing of our Queen. We're now going to resume drawing from history. This is going to be part two of our series on Giorgione. And as you can see, there are lots of things about art and about the history of art that are so important, so empowering. And my appreciation for the history of art is very much caught up in my personal feelings about tradition generally. And the monarchy is a huge, huge aspect of that. And so I just couldn't proceed without having made some sort of acknowledgement. Okay, so we're going to begin the workshop proper with this portrait of an archer, which is attributed to Giorgione. And I mentioned something in my acknowledgement of the Queen, that men in battle would be singled out in the Middle Ages by the monarch. King Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt, for example, ennobled a number of archers who exhibited brilliance in that battle, and they were given status and recognition, even though they may have been from a very low social standing originally. And here we have a portrait of an archer painted possibly by Giorgione. It may be an early copy of a lost original. But that's the thing with Giorgione, is that there's a tremendous amount of mystery surrounding him, surrounding his life, and surrounding his output as an artist. So we're going to begin this painting. We're going to begin the workshop with this painting because it gives us a sense of both that mystery around Giorgione, and it also tied in quite nicely with what I wanted to say just a moment or so ago. So while you're working from this amazing piece, I'll just give you a brief recap and an introduction to today's session. So Giorgione, who was born Giorgio di Castelfranco, he was often nicknamed Zorzo, which means is a derivation of Giorgio in northern Italy. He was born sometime in the second half of the 1470s, but may have been born slightly earlier. We don't have an exact date for his date of birth. Very, very little is known about his life. More is known about the circumstances of his death than is known about his life. And so he's born around 1475, 1478, and then he dies in 1510, dies of the plague. And as you could see from our welcome screen, where we looked at that wonderful portrait of a young man, one of Giorgione's earliest paintings, if it is indeed by Giorgione, we could see how much he drew from Giovanni Bellini's innovations and Bellini's approach, yet with a new level of intimacy and emotive exchange between the subject and the viewer. That's something that really distinguishes Giorgione from all painters prior to him, is that he builds on the innovations of preceding artists and yet takes strides forward in terms of his capacity to engage the viewer in a kind of dialogue, in an emotive exchange, in an intimate exchange, where one can feel that they are not just alone when they're looking at this painting, but the painting is in a way interacting back with them. That's something that really distinguishes Giorgione from all preceding painters. Now, only 4 pieces of documentation regarding his works exist. Documentation from his lifetime, that is, and they relate to a 1506 painting, the so-called Laura from 1506 or around then, the terrace portrait, and 2 other works which are now unknown, apart from a fragment of a wall. So that 4th work is a fresco. So we only have 4 works where any documentation survives pertaining to them. And yet his death is recorded quite, his death is recorded in quite not a careless way, but in a way which is more interested in the work, but doesn't explicitly explain much about his work. His death is mentioned in a letter written in 1510 by Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, and she notes that he died of the plague in Venice. So while we know a little bit about his death, we know more about his death than the circumstances of his death in his life, and we only have documentation from his lifetime regarding his work. We only have 4 small pieces of documentation about his work. We do know a tremendous amount about his reputation and fame and the impact he made. His works must have been truly mesmerizing to his contemporaries. And there are 2 titans of Renaissance intellectual culture who write quite extensively about art and who mention Giorgione in very, 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 very grand terms. Baldassare Castiglione is one of the most important scholars of the 16th century. In his book of the Courtier, listed Giorgione among the greatest painters of the day. And he published his book of the Courtier in the 1520s, so more than a decade after Giorgione's death, and when Titian had become the painter to the Republic of Venice. Titian became painter to the Republic of Venice in 1516 upon the death of Giovanni Bellini. And instead of mentioning Titian in his list of the greatest Italian painters, Castiglione mentions Giorgione. Now, Giorgione is a painter who is incredibly mysterious, who little was known of his life, who a great legend had arisen around, but yet his impact was so great. While there was such mystery surrounding him, Castiglione singled him out to rank among the greatest artists, among whom also ranked artists like Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and Mantegna. So that speaks volumes about Giorgione's reputation, even though he died incredibly young before he was able to reach his full maturity as an artist. And then the second great titan of Renaissance intellectual culture and artistic culture was Giorgio Vasari. And in his biographies of Giorgione, I say biographies because he published 2 editions of the lives of the artists. In both biographies of Giorgione, Vasari speaks of how profoundly pioneering and influential Giorgione was, and how he reshaped the future development of Venetian painting single-handedly. So he has immense impact. He's immensely famous in his day and in the years following his death, and yet we have never been able to fully determine exactly which works he painted and which works he didn't, but we can really discern what made him so great. A great legend arose surrounding Giorgione. We will never be able to discover much of the truth about him. We'll never be able to discern many of the facts of his life, but we can touch and feel the warmth behind the facts through the works which remain and which can be said to reflect his own unique touch. What Giorgione really does build upon is a vast array of artistic ideas which he inherited from Giovanni Bellini, also Leonardo da Vinci, and from the classical texts. Pliny the Elder had written a great deal on painting and the lives of ancient painters, and that had a big impact on shaping Giorgione's approach, but also poetics and literature. There's a great literary tilt in Giorgione's works, which is one of the primary subjects of our series on him. So Leonardo had actually been to Venice in 1500, and that's why scholars discuss the extent to which there could have been a direct exchange between Leonardo as an older artist and the younger Giorgione. So is this a portrait? It's known as, it's referred to as a portrait of an archer, but is it a portrait at all? Or is it merely a painting which reflects a particular moment in time, or a particular feeling which sometimes arises in particular moments where we don't know quite how to react to someone simply appearing? He looks as though he's been made jump. He looks rather shocked or startled by our appearance, as though he's heard us arrive and he's looked to us and his head is tilted back in recognition of our sudden appearance, and his hand is risen to his sternum. His fingers are there just below the pit of his neck, as though he's been startled. And so there's a sense of movement and a certain level of dramatization here, but there's also a sense of interaction, an actual direct, immediate interaction with the viewer. So is this a portrait, or is this a commentary on those ideas? One thing about Giorgione is that we don't always know what category his paintings belong to. And while this is recognized as a portrait, there are lots of things about this painting and lots of things lacking in this painting, which might make the question arise as to whether this belongs to the category of portraiture. Does this belong to a category at all? And if it does, is portraiture the correct one, or is this a genre painting? A painting which reflects ideas regarding human interaction, of human emotions, and moral and ethical and emotive exchange between individuals. So this painting could be as much about those ideas as it could be about the identity of this particular person. And Giorgione doesn't give us any clues about the specific personal identity of this person. We are given the sense that he is an archer. He's wearing a breastplate, but he's not wearing a helmet. That's not necessarily essential to be an archer. An archer could wear a helmet, and an archer wouldn't always wear a carbon steel breastplate. A breastplate like that would have been immensely expensive, and archers were not the elite soldiers in the Renaissance. The elite soldiers were the knights in armor and the men at arms, all who wore full plate armor and wore helmets. Whereas we do not see a livery, we do not see a coat of arms, we do not see a helmet, we don't even see the bow. But what we do see, which singles him out as an archer, is that glove. So that finger is protected, whereas the others are not. So he can fetch his arrows without being encumbered by the glove covering all of his fingertips, and yet that one index finger is protected from the drawing of the bow. Now, an English archer wouldn't have actually needed that protection of the fingers. They used to pull the string back on its own with 2 or 3 fingers like that, the English archers. But English archery is very different to European archery, Italian and French archery, because we had a completely different appreciation of the bow and of the practice of archery. We were quite unique in the Middle Ages and in the early modern era for our commitment to archery. Every man was obliged by law to practice with a bow after church every Sunday throughout the Middle Ages, whereas that wasn't the case in Italy and France. And there was a greater reliance on the crossbow in France and Italy, whereas in England, the English warbow made of yew, which was imported from Scandinavia, was a primary weapon of war. And the warbow was the English longbow, otherwise known as the English warbow, was a huge, huge advantage to the English. Also, the skill and strength of our archers was unmatched in medieval and early modern Europe. So we know he's an archer. He does have a breastplate on, and there's something rather exquisite about this breastplate. We've got that beautiful crimson cord being used to harness the breastplate around his shoulders, which is really important. The breastplate isn't just plonked over the head; it's harnessed on. There's another, the word harness and armor interchangeable as well in this period. Knights of France during the 100 Years' War would refer to their armor as white harness, because the plate steel was shiny, would glisten white in the daylight, and so it's called white harness. A suit of armor can also just be called a harness. Okay, so we've got this beautiful piece of harness or armor tied around the archer's chest. It's a breastplate. He's wearing his archer's glove. But as I mentioned earlier, we don't have any other indications of his personal identity, which is why it seems not to just simply belong to the category of portraiture, but could also be a genre painting or an allegorical painting. Think of the previous image, the welcome screen painting, where I showed you the portrait of the young man. Both of these paintings appear to be portraits, but they equally appear to be reflections on a moment in time, a moment of quietness, a moment on the reflection of selfhood, a reflection on some point of human experience, of some aspect of human experience. So we don't know the identity of the sitters, and but the identity of the sitter, even though we don't know it, wouldn't necessarily be what gives these paintings their substance. It's rather the mood of the paintings, the movement and the poise and the inclination or the poetry of the paintings that gives them their substance. Giorgione doesn't give us an identity beyond the youth, the likeness, and the attire of these subjects. And yet the substance goes far deeper and wider beyond them. The meaning lies in the gaze, in the poise, and in the inclination and in the movement, which all coalesce into a moral exchange or emotive exchange with the viewer. So there's a bit more of a dramatic movement in this painting compared to the previous image, which we've looked at, the Giustiniani portrait, which is called that because of the family it belonged to. We did look at that more extensively last week. That was a painting that we looked at in quite a lot of detail last week. So when I put that up on YouTube in a week's time, you'll be able to go back to that and enjoy that workshop as well. There's something really astonishing about that breastplate. It's got a really wonderful reflection of the hand in there. That's an element of naturalism which hadn't really been explored. Now, Northern artists, you know, the Renaissance painters of the Netherlands had done lots of paintings. If you think of Jan van Eyck and Roger van der Weyden, there are lots of paintings where the naturalism of the interior and the reflective qualities of objects within the scene have been depicted with a tremendous detail and such close observation. And this is an element of that seeping in, that reflection and that naturalistic reflection of the hand on the breastplate certainly draws from Northern influence. And the generations of artists that led up to Giorgione were very receptive to Northern ideas. Think about Andrea Mantegna, Giovanni Bellini, and Antonello da Messina. These are all artists who were keenly aware of developments in the North, which influenced the Italians to be more aware of naturalistic detail in an environment and the reflective qualities of shiny objects. Okay, so yeah, what's interesting about this painting as well is that we don't really know if it's by Giorgione, and it may be a very early copy of a lost original. The painting is also heavily restored, which might disguise some of Giorgione's, if he painted it, his initial intentions, even his final intentions for the outcome of the painting. We won't know. We probably won't find that out unless more documentation is identified, which could indicate that this painting is by Giorgione. But what we do have is a profound sense of Giorgione's influence and touch in the involvement of this painting. So if it isn't a Giorgione, it's certainly someone who was heavily impacted by him and was perhaps even guided by him. There are no other artists of this generation who as independent artists would have produced something like this, I would contend. And so I think it has a moderately good claim to either be by Giorgione or by someone who was a very close follower of him, who was possibly even guided by Giorgione. Okay, so that's the first painting I wanted us to look at, and I really hope you're enjoying drawing this one. I'll give you a few minutes before we go and look at our next painting. Our next painting is another fascinating one, possibly showing Giorgione's interest in military culture. It's a portrait or a painting of a knight with a squire, which you may be familiar with already, especially if you've been to Florence. It hangs in the Uffizi Gallery. This painting, as you can see, is in the National Gallery of Scotland in Edinburgh, where the Queen is currently at rest, which is another reason I made this the first one that we would look at tonight. Okay, so we are now going to just have a few more moments looking at this painting. I really love the way the eyes look straight into ours. There's also a sense of noise with the mouth. It looks as though he's just responding to us, as though we've engaged him in conversation. And I love that residual sense of movement where he has simply leant back slightly, tilted his head back slightly, opened his mouth to utter something, and placed his hand upon his chest. Very subtle, very delicate, and highly poetic. Great use of chiaroscuro as well, very, very dramatic, but the restoration could be accountable for that, or the decline of the painting. The painting is not in particularly good condition, and so the darkening of the paint could account for some of that dramatic chiaroscuro. There's something we all have to be aware of as people who look at the historical art, is that these artworks have a complex life of their own, and they aren't often the same as they were when they were originally finished. Okay, so let's move on to the next painting. We've got here a knight with his squire. Now, this is a very, very interesting painting. There have been interesting interpretations. Two main interpretations of this painting are that they depict Gattamelata, who was a great and incredibly famous condottiere, or a great mercenary soldier in Italy during the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. Gattamelata was also depicted by Donatello in the years preceding Giorgione, and that famous equestrian monument by Donatello in Padua will be known to many of you, I'm sure. And so that's one theory, that it depicts Gattamelata as a young knight with a squire, or with his son. Another theory is that it depicts one of the chief lieutenants of Alexander the Great, but wearing contemporary 16th century armor. That's something that artists in Venice really love to experiment with and explore, and that was giving historical figures an appearance of being in the contemporary world. That's something that characterizes Renaissance art in general as well, quite broadly. Artists like Luca Signorelli or Pietro Perugino wouldn't depict a painting of the mother and child as though they were in the first century Near East. They would depict them as though they were in an ideal transcendental landscape, wearing attire which would possibly have been familiar to people of their own time. And that's what Giorgione is doing here. Whether he's depicting Gattamelata or whether he's depicting one of Alexander's great lieutenants, he is depicting them in the armor of the early 1500s. Now, I've read in some of the scholarship that this armor is supposed to be indicative of horseback combat, and there are certainly some indications that this could be very true, such as the spurs just next to the helmet. But the helmet could have been deliberately made in that way for horseback combat, but knights in the Middle Ages would often have had breaths only on the right side of their visor, whereas there are breaths on the left side of that visor, which is not always advisable for horseback fighting, because the knights on horseback would often take lances, and so would often be hit with lances, and so they wouldn't want breaths to be on both sides of their visor there. So that's a detail which probably won't be that relevant to everybody. It's interesting how the squire is wearing the bavor as though he's carrying some of the armor himself by wearing it before it's put on onto the knight. I think the handling of this painting gives it a really strong claim to be a Giorgione. It's very, 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 very like the approach that Giorgione pioneered, and artists of Giorgione's generation really pioneered, and he was a very central figure in this technique of painting from dark to light. And you can see how the light layers of paint have really been built up over more transparent layers of dark paint. And it's at this point in which painting really undergoes a transformation in the opening years of the 1500s, where not only are canvases being favored over wooden panels, but the grounds that artists are painting on become darker. This really did begin with, 2 generations earlier with artists like Mantegna. He started to paint on canvas for permanent artworks and would make use of the dark ground of the canvas itself after it had been sized with hide glue. But it looks as though Giorgione here has gessoed the canvas and then laid a dark ground on top of the gesso in order to be able to work more independently from a drawing and to be able to model the composition directly in paint, going from darker layers up to lighter layers until you arrive at the opaque lights which are placed at the very end. So the technique is very, very experimental. It's where Giorgione is really pioneering this new approach new approach to painting in oils, which reverses the more traditional approach of tempera painting and very, very early oil painting. And as you can see, both on the reproduction and on the side, this painting hangs in the Galleria degli Uffizi in Florence, which I'm sure many of you have visited at some point and probably will do in the future. Okay, so as again it's attributed to Giorgione. We don't have absolute certainty, but I think this has a strong acclaim as the others that rank among supposedly autograph paintings by Giorgione to be by him. So the knight. What does the knight symbolize? What does the knight mean? Well, I mentioned chivalry slightly earlier when I was talking about our late Queen. And the knight is really a symbol of that. The knight is really a symbol of chivalry. Chivalry is something that the French founded in the High Middle Ages, when knights were expected to display tremendous courage and tremendous fortitude and tremendous capability. There arose a new moral code. And this wasn't a simple moral code around masculine figures showing how tremendously strong they were and how dominant they were and how elite they were. This was far more complex than that. It's something that arose within a context which in and of itself was incredibly complex and multidimensional and multifaceted. And so by the very late Middle Ages, in the 15th century, one of the chief authorities on chivalry, knightly conduct, knightly honor, knightly morality, the proper conduct of, chivalry can apply to all of us, but one of the chief authorities on chivalry, one of the towering intellectuals of chivalry, was a woman called Christine de Pizan. And her texts concerning chivalric conduct and knightly honor were read by kings across Europe, kings and monarchs across Europe. So even one of our greatest kings, Henry V, consulted Christine de Pizan's work on military strategy and proper knightly conduct. So she was a great authority on chivalry. And that's what knights really symbolize, chivalry. And there are lots of rules that knights have to abide by. If someone surrenders, you are to take them as prisoner. You are not to execute a prisoner unless you're simply not supposed to execute a prisoner. You're meant to take them ransom. And one part of chivalric conduct is that every man at arms, every knight has a brother in arms. And that brother in arms is the first individual who has responsibility to accrue funds to pay your ransom if you are indeed captured or taken prisoner, or if you surrender. So there are, and you know, and chivalry is all about exhibiting the best qualities you can as a knight, being really selfless for your country and being really brave in making sacrifices on the battlefield, and you know, serving your own army and your own king and your own monarch and your own nation with valor and integrity. That's what chivalry is really about, and it's something that I think ought to be pondered on from time to time, and we ought to be reminded of it as a positive influence on life. So we got amazing, you know, not only is the knight a symbol of chivalry, but also the sword. The sword is not just a weapon, it's a great symbol of knighthood. It's a symbol of justice in many artworks as well. It's a symbol of judgment. In the Bible, it's mentioned that Christ would return with bearing a sword. And it's not because he's going to return as a warrior, but as a judge. Okay, so there's a sense, you know, and he's holding the crossguard, the Quillen crossguard of the sword there. And the sword does not have its scabbard on, which means that it's ready for use. It's ready for combat. It's battle ready. And that doesn't particularly look like a battle ready weapon. It looks like a ceremonial weapon because of its decorative qualities. All swords in the Middle Ages would have been highly decorated, especially if they belonged to a high status knight, and a knight would fight with a highly decorated array of arms and highly decorated armor. But that's because everything in early modernity and in the Middle Ages was highly decorated. Material culture in historical times wasn't industrialized, there was a degree of mass production, but not mass production in the manner that we in which pertains now. Mass production revolved around highly specialized craftspeople making the same thing repeatedly with tremendous skill and tremendous efficiency. And so you did have large quantities of things made, but material culture in this period was, you know, each item that was crafted was treated as very special and would therefore be beautified. So even the mace has got brass finishings, possibly even gold finishings. If he's a very high standing knight, then he would have gold finishings on his armor and weaponry. So the armor is early 16th century. That helmet is quite hard to, it's not an armor, it's not a closed helm. It's kind of shaped like a sallet helmet. And it has a boar skull, or it has a kind of boar skull visor. I'm not an armor expert, but it's an interesting helmet. If it was used for horseback combat, it looks more like a ground fighting helmet to me. But the spurs are clearly indicative of horseback combat, and the knight is usually perceived to be a horse riding warrior, a mounted warrior. So this does give me thought. This does remind me of Donatello, this painting, because there are two beautiful paintings, two beautiful sculptures by Donatello. His St. George, where he makes a commentary on the knight in his beautiful marble sculpture of St. George at the Orson Michele Church in Florence, but also his David. It reminds me of the David as well. And both of those works by Donatello give you an insight into Donatello's ideas about the warrior and about the hero. And his David is the very ironic hero, the youth, the beardless youth who looks incredibly weak, even effete, even, you know, decadent. And he has yet become a great hero of the Jewish people of the Old Testament, of the Israelites of the Old Testament. And so and then also Donatello's St. George is there with a sword and shield, two great symbols of knighthood. And he's youthful, and he also shows a great deal of complex emotion, including fear, potentially. And so what are the emotions we've got here? We have movement in the head, and the movement in the head is accentuated by the tilt and the turn of the head, but also the hair moving. So it's like waving with the movement. So the painting implies motion, which is more indicative of his readiness for battle. His hair might move like that as he mounts his horse, his war horse. And so there's that battle ready element to it, which is telegraphed by the movement and the unsheathed sword. But there's still a great sense of youthfulness in the painting, and he looks very cool and reserved. His gaze is melancholy and subdued. And so there's that ambiguity, isn't there? There's the subdued melancholia of the expression in the gaze and the youthfulness of his face. And yet there is the battle-ready movement and the battle-ready sword. And so those two different aesthetic values and moral values seem to contradict one another in a very interesting and ambiguous way, which is another reason to consider this painting by Giorgione, or at least heavily influenced by him or guided by him. While this painting hung in Prague, in the collections of Prague Castle, it was considered to depict the great knight, or the great condottiere, Gattamelata, whose name was actually Erasmo of Narni, Narni in Umbria, who was born around 1370 and who died in 1443. The great condottiere Gattamelata, who was known as the honey, well, Gattamelata means the honeyed cat. And he was a great mercenary soldier, otherwise known as a condottiero. So, and so if that's the case, then Giorgione is drawing from this sort of recent historical figure who had been depicted by Donatello, as I mentioned earlier. I spoke about the Donatello equestrian statue of Gattamelata from 1453, which is in Padua. So is he depicting that figure, Gattamelata, or is he depicting Cleitus, the lieutenant of Alexander? Now, if he is painting this classical figure, this figure from classical Greece, then Giorgione is actually drawing upon ancient ideas which he's come across in Pliny the Elder. Now, painters of this time were becoming increasingly erudite, and there's absolutely no question that Giorgione had some literary grasp. He had a grasp of literature, he had a grasp of ideas. There's just no way that we can conceive that Giorgione was an unlettered individual. He may not have been traditionally schooled, he may not have had a humanistic education, he may not have been able to read Latin, he may not have been fully literate. We don't know. We don't know if he had an education or what his education was, but his paintings certainly do belie a keen grasp of classical ideas and poetic thinking, which gives us a plausible argument that Giorgione was familiar with Pliny the Elder, who wrote about Apelles, the great painter of ancient Greece, who had painted Cleitus, the lieutenant of Alexander, before he left to war in Asia. So this could depict one or the two figures, and whether or not it is Cleitus, Giorgione has depicted him in contemporary armor which is contemporary to his own day. So just a couple of moments now before we go and look at our next painting, and I shall just talk about the influence of previous artists here. We do have a parapet or a ledge in between our space and the space of these subjects. But what Giorgione has done with that parapet is he's cluttered it with still life. So the space of the sitters and our space as the viewers is divided by not just the fact that this is a painted surface and we are a physical thing, but that parapet is created that division between our space and the space within the painting. And yet the still life seems to engage us. The light shimmers out of the painting into our space, and also the handle of the mace. The mace is another knightly weapon. And we feel like we could kind of reach in and grab that mace. The mace isn't quite securely placed on there. Now think about Caravaggio. Caravaggio liked to play with this idea, didn't he? In Caravaggio's beautiful Supper at Emmaus, which he painted for the Mattei brothers, the fruit bowl is about to fall off the table, isn't it? Now, we know that Caravaggio is very familiar with Giorgione's works. Is this, you know, Giorgione playing with ideas or advancing further on ideas that were laid down by Giovanni Bellini and then providing stimulation for future generations? There's no doubt that that happened. I mean that's so well documented and so well known that Giorgione greatly impacted future generations and even his own generation of artists and even his own teacher, who we consider to be Giorgione's teacher, Giovanni Bellini. He died in 1516, 6 years after Giorgione died. And in Bellini's work, he shows that he himself was even influenced by the younger artist Giorgione. And scholars of Caravaggio have no question in their mind that there's a tremendous debt that characterizes Caravaggio's reception of Giorgione. Caravaggio is tremendously indebted to the legacy of Giorgione because Giorgione did so much to alter the course and future development of painting across the world. All right, so fantastic. We are steaming through the workshop at breakneck speed, and I hope you're all really enjoying it. So what we're going to do now is look at the next painting. And I hope you will all enjoy looking at this much more peaceful image, much more calming image. We've had two images which have close references to knighthood and warfare, and this image has none. This is what we're going to end with. This is going to be something I give you a nice bit of time to work from. And it is another of Giorgione's early paintings. This is held at the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. And there's relatively strong consensus that this is a painting by Giorgione and that it isn't merely a highly questionable attribution, which is quite rare. So interesting that Giorgione hasn't given us the Madonna's feet in this painting. It's quite important that we see the Madonna's feet, and you will notice from now on when you go to galleries and museums and look at icons and paintings of the Madonna that you're presented with her feet poking through her draperies. But in this painting we're not. The reason why we're supposed to see the Virgin's feet is because we're meant to be able to kiss them, or at least imagine kissing them. And that's all bound up with a revival of imperial imagery and convention during the Central Middle Ages, from around 800 onwards, with the crowning of Charlemagne as Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And so the kissing of the feet was an imperial convention, and it became a norm for us to be able to see them, the Virgin's feet, so you give her that level of veneration that we might give to an earthly emperor. But she's obviously far greater than any earthly ruler. She's one of the most significant theological figures in our culture, really. Now, there are lots of things that Giorgione is doing here which follows in the wake of Bellini. But there are other things that he does which are connected to those, which are very different. Think back to when we were looking at Giovanni Bellini, we saw that he made these amazingly organized landscapes with these horizontal bands. Bellini would do something like put the sky in one horizontal band, and then beautiful mountains in the background in another horizontal band, and then put a beautiful pastoral landscape somewhere in the middle, and then bring us closer to the foreground in these sort of staggered stages, which consisted of a very thought out composition comprising a number of horizontal bands, as I've said. But what Giorgione is doing here is he's painting a landscape very much in the style of Bellini, with that level of detail, with that little bit of architecture, looking very much like a beautiful Veneto landscape. And yet the bands are not so distinct. They kind of blend into one another and juxtapose one another in a different type of organization. There's a lot of rock as well. Lots of rock, lots of stone. There are mountains, there are caves. You can see two caves just beside the Virgin's head, to the right and above her head. She's also sitting on this great rock, leaning forward, just clasping the head of her child, who seems to have just been breastfeeding. The child is looking out, not quite at us, but into our space, gazing out of the painted world into the world that we occupy. And he's in a very, very unconventional position, and he is exhibiting tremendous movement, as is she. She's leaning forward to catch the head of the child. Giorgione's giving another sense of reality to this sacred image. You know, he's a living, breathing, moving, sometimes awkwardly moving human child, and she's having to lunge forward to protect him with her hand there. So another moment in time that Giorgione is capturing, using poise, using gaze of Christ there looking out to us, and the movement of Mary and of Christ. Another moment in time. This is clearly a virgin and child, and yet it could also simply be a mother and child. It doesn't need to be the virgin and child, because of that reality that Giorgione is capturing, that everyday reality that he's capturing, but also the way that he's hiding her feet. He's denying us that convention that had arisen from the Middle Ages onwards. Covering up her feet doesn't necessarily diminish her status, but it does arouse a sense of ambiguity. Why is he doing that? Is he doing what we think he might want to do? You know, we must really refrain from projecting our own modern ideas onto an artist from many centuries ago. Now, as a modern person, I mean, I don't really count as a modern person because I live in the 15th century. But for a modern person, you may be one, you might want to think that he's making a commentary on the real motherhood, that he's not painting the Virgin and Child, that he's just painting something real. We might want to think that as modern people, but it's highly unlikely, given that Giorgione was around in the late 15th century, early 16th century, and the veiled head of the Virgin is indicative of her pure moral purity and chastity. She is, after all, a virgin. That white veil is indicative of her virginity, and yet she holds a child who she has been feeding. And so she is the Virgin Mother of Christ. But the feet being hidden gives me a sense of ambiguity, and the fact that he puts so much movement and immediacy in how he's depicted them seems to introduce some ambiguity to it, that she is a normal living human woman as well, just as he is a normal living human child. So he gives a bit more living humanity to these divine figures in those ways. Tremendous modeling with oils, and this is very traditional modeling that he's given these the drapery there with the vermilion and the red lake on top. He's not depicted her with lapis lazuli. He's got a green pigment. That green looks as though it's a mixture of azurite and lead tin yellow. That's the kind of mixture I see, but I may be wrong. It might be other pigments. It wouldn't have been verdigris, because the verdigris would be brown by now. I very much doubt it would be malachite, because malachite fades. It's very, very impermanent. The blue shawl around her is probably azurite, which does fade. There may be some lapis lazuli, but not a very high grade of lapis lazuli in the sky. And the pigments being used. I suspect that the green that she's wearing is a mixture. Very uncommon for Renaissance artists to rely on mixing their colors. They used pigments. It's neat. They just bound the pigment in a binder. Here he's used oil paint, maybe some tempera in preliminary layers, but they didn't mix their colors. They glazed them. They didn't really rely on mixing colors, unless it was something that wasn't attainable. And green is quite a tricky one in the Renaissance, because artists knew that verdigris wasn't particularly reliable, and malachite was expensive and wasn't ever so reliable, whereas colors like lead white and colors like vermilion are very reliable. And the red lake pigments like rose madder and cochineal, they are light fast when they are glazed very thinly on top of a darker pigment. And the way that Giorgione's used that there, the vermilion and then the lake pigment on top, is the proper way to use those pigments. All right, so and also light. It's a very light painting. There isn't such depth of chiaroscuro here. It's not a very dramatic landscape, except for the caves. The caves give us that balance of darkness there and the sense of darkness, but it's a tremendously light painting otherwise. And there is a wonderful sense of an expanse of space here, which gives us that sense of tranquility and quiet and peace. Very dynamic landscape in composition. Those bands are all kind of intersecting in an unusual and writhing way, with beautiful diagonal contours. So, beautiful painting of the Madonna and Child. We'll be just drawing for a few more moments before we wrap up the session. And I look forward to seeing your drawings at the end. I really hope you've all enjoyed today. And yeah, it's been a very, very special session indeed. So a few more moments now, and then we'll draw things to a close. What I'll point out in the remaining moments is some of the details which I find really interesting. The beautiful foliage in the foreground. That's something that was so important to Giovanni Bellini, but also in the 15th century, you know, Giovanni Bellini was a great 15th century painter, but also Piero della Francesca. Piero della Francesca was a great artist from San Sepolcro, who would include his own regional organic life in his paintings as well, like the Baptism of Christ, which hangs in the National Gallery. That amazing painting has got very unique greenery from his own district. And I think that that's something that Bellini did, and I think that's something that Giorgione was very receptive to and is responding to in this painting. We've got some beautiful detailed foliage in the foreground, some flowers and grasses and leaves and plants to give a bit of softness in and amongst all of that rock. It's a very rock heavy painting. It's like a painting equivalent of Led Zeppelin. It's such hard rock. And I love all of the detailed brush strokes on the grass in the background. It reminds me of Dürer, a detailed observation of nature. So lots of, you know, German and other northern influences in and amongst the influence from Bellini and Leonardo. I know, think about Leonardo painting the Virgin of the rocks. You know, this is like Giorgione's quieter, lighter version. There's also a cave there, which is reminiscent of Leonardo's Virgin of the Rocks. Two versions of which, one in the Louvre in Paris and the other in London in the National Gallery. Okay, so everybody, thank you so much for joining me tonight. It's been a very special workshop. I hope you really, really enjoyed it. And yeah, I look forward to drawing with you all again very, very soon. Thank you very much indeed. So